Hey everybody, I'm back with another one of these design consideration iPad videos. And today I wanted to talk about this Austrian Black Pine, which I bought from Andy out at Golden Arrow Bonsai a couple of years ago. And this one, there's a lot of different options. At this point, it has a lot of branching that needs to go in the next year for sure. Um, as I move it a little bit more toward a refinement and also create some space for some back buds to hopefully develop a little further down in the trunk. So I've got it pulled up here, and we could take a look. Generally, this one, in all of these videos, I am aiming to identify a front and a back. In the case of this one and the hornbeam I did a couple of episodes ago, it's clear that the person who sold it to me had picked a front or a partial selection of a front. And that's usually indicated, if you're new to this, that's usually indicated by the long side of the pot if it's a rectangular or oval pot. If it's a circular pot, sometimes you can tell by where the feet are. Either there'll be 2 feet right in the front or 1 foot dead center in the front. But the front is an important consideration, and it is the way that we determine design, because a tree is designed to be viewed from the front. Obviously, with a painting, it's a little more obvious, because if you viewed it from the back, it would just be kind of the back of a frame and some brown paper probably. But in the case of the tree, I think we can think about, and probably should think about, viewing the tree from all sides, but there definitely is a distinct front. So just for what it's worth. So when I call this the back, it's because it's one of the long sides of the pot, and to me it's not the front. One of the big reasons why I don't think, at least initially, it was intended to be the front is because this branch here is moving, in this case, away from the viewer. It's pretty extensively leaning, again, away from the viewer in this case. And so that's why I think, at least based on the design here and based on the initial plans that Andy had for this tree, putting it in this pot, I think this is probably the back. So if we change it up and go over to where I think probably his proposed front was, I think this is probably the proposed front. And so, if you recall from the locust video, one of the things that's a little bit distracting here is that this line here is very, very straight. That's, it's part of the composition. At least it's off. It's not directly vertical, which is good. But that's something that, we may want to consider if we want to change things up. Another thing, at least at this point, this feels very artificial to me, the big S curve. And this is just the way you put the bends in, and then the tree does its own thing. And so it could very well be that this curve looked more natural before, but then as it's developed, it's kind of gone in a different direction. You could see a few wire scars, here and here. Those will heal out, no problem. But so in this case, I think this is one of the first ones where I think I'm going to probably work off of. Let me go to the gallery. I'm actually probably going to work off of my own alternate front. The reason why I like this is because I think it gets us a little off of the big the big straight line. There's a little bit of this curve in here, a little gentle movement here. It does feel less ramrod straight than the other front. I would expect or hope maybe over time that this gap here down at the base will fill in. And if that's the case, let me just make sure I'm on a new layer here. If that's the case, and you can see that visually, if we fill that in and continue to grow this out and develop this, nice strong base, little bit of gentle movement up, and then up to the curve. So to me, we'll figure this out, and I may change the orientation. We'll see. I don't know. That all is great, and it's important to think through. But to me, in the more immediate future, one of the things that I'm thinking about is what in the heck am I doing with everything up here? There is a lot of branching up there, and there are, let me get a little bit brighter, brighter green here. There are bar branches here, and here, and here, and here, and maybe even here, and here. I can't exactly tell. So if you aren't familiar with the bar branch, this means that you have your central stem, and then out from it on either side you have branches that come out. In the case of a pine, sometimes you'll have even more than two. You'll have 3 or 4, and that's sometimes called a whorl, W-H-O-R-L. There's a couple of issues with that. In general, the rule or the practice, whatever you want to, the principle is that counting the central stem, you only want 2 pieces involved in every junction. So in other words, if this central stem is 1, this upper branch is 2, this one is 3. So in other words, we're going to need to get rid of one of those 2 branches. There's reasons why. One, it doesn't necessarily look very good. It looks very young. It makes the tree look juvenile. But the other more important reason is when these branches continue to grow, what will happen is this area will thicken and thicken and thicken and thicken and thicken, and it gets to a point where that area is thicker than the than the trunk line below it. This was what's sometimes called reverse taper, inverse taper. It's considered a structural flaw. All those things are used to describe this. So the balancing act when you're developing a tree is that you have to decide how long you want to let this stuff grow, when you want to take it off, and which branch you want to take off. So you may be asking, well, why don't you just go ahead from the very get-go, when a tree is young, go ahead and just take, let me see here. Go ahead and just take this branch off. Well, there is a huge advantage to having more needles on a tree in the younger years, because it will allow it to photosynthesize better. It'll allow it to put on more vascular tissue. And if we decide ultimately, let's say that we're going to cut this whole thing off here, well, we don't really care about a reverse taper up here, because all of this is going away. And so, in other words, it's this balancing act between having more photosynthetic potential, more leaves, more needles, whatever it may be, versus having structural flaws and too much, too many branches in those places. Again, I mentioned pines will often have multiple branches coming out of the same point. They call this a whorl. In deciduous trees, maples are what is called an opposite leaf pattern, and so from every central stem, it'll send out a leaf on either side. So that's another example where eventually you're going to have to remove one of those 2 branches, otherwise it's going to create a structural flaw. Anyway, so if we grab our eraser and get rid of all this for a minute. So what am I going to do with this? I do not honestly know. So one thing that I would say is that if I have the option to continue thickening this trunk here and through here, I would like to do that. I would like for this to be eventually to be let me get an actual brown here. I would eventually love for this to thicken out to look something like this. We're talking about probably decades of growth, but hey, we don't get into this for the brief interludes. If I want this part of the trunk to get thicker, what I have to have is plenty of photosynthetic mass up above the trunk. In other words, I need to keep some of this branching. This is where we see the development of what would be called a sacrifice branch. That's one way to think about doing this. And so my guess is what I'm going to do is I'm going to probably come in here and I'm probably going to reduce both of these branches here, and I'm probably going to cut this branch off here, and I'm just going to leave this central stem with this green stuff up here. And over time, it will grow out longer and longer and longer. And the whole time that that's happening, I will be removing the material. Let's make this a little bigger, not that big. Removing all this material in here. So eventually, the main structure of the tree here, and over time, as I continue to do this, there will be a true sacrifice branch that ends up being very, very long, ends up growing out to, this sort of length, and up above here, up here, there will be additional foliage that is continuing to pull. It's continuing to pull resources up. Now, at some point in a future, I will cut this off and remove it. And so, why are we doing that with a sacrifice branch? Well, just remember, when you have resources up here, I think of almost like having people in the suburbs. The more people you have up here in the suburbs, the more roads you need to get them the resources they need from down here at the root system. In a tree, the roadways are the vascular system of the tree, which we think of as the trunk thickness and branch thickness. So, the more stuff we have up here, above this branch, the thicker this part of the trunk needs to be, the thicker this part of the trunk needs to be, and you get this overall thickening process. And then, as I said, get rid of all the arrows. At some point, I will come along and I will change my thing here. I will get rid of this branch. And at that point, we'll probably have some shorter needles too. And now my overall height of my tree will be reduced. I'll also probably come in and trim back some of these branches here to compress the design. Bring these in here maybe. And over time, as the foliage shrinks, the trunk has gotten thicker and the trunk looks even more powerful with each passing step. So just to give you a quick reference, this is where we are now. This is where we would be. So that's before thickening, after thickening. I think over time I'm going to try to make this into a more compact. I don't really prefer the terms masculine and feminine because I don't think they really are good descriptors. It's not really like a social. It is partially a feminist social thing, but also it just isn't good terminology. But over time, I think I do want this to be a stockier, more powerful, more striking, as opposed to a slender, delicate, dancing kind of energy. As I do that, so if I maybe project what my branch structure might end up looking like, I'm just going to get rid of this here, and maybe just go down to like the trunk line. I could imagine, let's see, change over to my pencil. Change over to some gray. I could imagine a nice branch here. I could imagine these branches coming down here. I could imagine this being kind of the structure for an apex, right? So let's change over to some dark green, maybe, and then so suddenly this is kind of our apex area. This goes out here like this. These are down here like this. And then suddenly it starts to take on a very like bonsai-esque structure, right? It has this very informal, upright, with some interesting movement type approach. So this is one way of doing this. Another way of doing it, if we get rid of all the foliage and stuff I just built, would be to say, actually, we're going to be even more drastic than that, and we're going to take all of this off. Back to here, maybe. Well, then now, okay, so now we've got a much shorter tree. It's even more compact. We're going to probably reduce some of this branching here to make it look a little more considerable. And then we grab some dark green, and maybe we construct an apex here. An apex here, and then be a secondary apex or like a branch structure here. The tree looks considerably smaller in some ways, but also with less foliage, the trunk line looks even more powerful. Okay, where the next step maybe is to go even a little more dramatic, a little more drastic, let's say, and like maybe we don't want this curve at all. Here we go. We say, okay, we're actually going to take this all the way back to here. It's pretty drastic, but hopefully you can see how enormous this makes the trunk look if you kind of squint your eyes a little bit. Now, obviously, this drawing is a bit crude. But if you had kind of like this apex here, and maybe we get a second bud over here, something like that, and these down here get developed. If you kind of squint your eyes and you see, then we do have this. If we do have this big, in fact, have this big, powerful, trunk here. Suddenly, you could imagine this being a huge ancient tree. So, if this feels like the least focused or clear one of these that I've done so far, it's because I'm really struggling with this. I am pretty positive that I will be starting to develop this section up here as a sacrifice branch. That's one thing that I'm pretty darn sure about. There are at least, so if you look down here, let me change to my pencil. There is a branch here, there is a branch here, and there is curiously a branch growing back across. And the angle of this branch to the thing here is really acute. It's very strange. So my guess is I'll probably take this branch off as well and start this bifurcation here. One other thing that I'll just mention, there's already covered a lot of content here, is that if you are trying to develop back budding, so on a pine, if I were to take, so let's just say I went and cut the tree off here, the tree would die. That is because it does not develop back buds without some amount of foliage out above it. So on the same thing on a branch, if you were to cut, let's get rid of that. If you were to cut this branch off here and there aren't any buds behind it, that branch will die. So, in other words, if you want to try and compress the design over time, if you want to cut, have this branch be shorter and have these branches be shorter, you have to work to develop back buds further back first before you cut back to them. In order to do that, you need two things. You need a lot of vigor in the plant, and you need a lot of sunlight to be able to help those buds to grow. All of this foliage up here is bad news for sunlight. So that's the other reason why I'm going to try to remove some of that foliage up here, remove some of this here, is to try and produce back buds further back. Bears told me it's time to go. So I'll see you in the next video.